There's a stretch of American railroad track that has been sitting on the exact same land, doing the exact same job, for over 150 years, and it is still one of the most profitable pieces of infrastructure on the planet. Not a tech company, not a bank, a railroad. Something so old-fashioned that most people assume it barely still exists outside of freight trains they wait behind at a crossing. And yet Warren Buffett, arguably the most successful investor in modern history, once spent over $30 billion to buy one outright, calling it an all-in wager on the economic future of the country itself. So what does it actually take to own something like that? What does the business behind a freight railroad really look like once you strip away the nostalgia and look at the numbers? Because the answer involves some of the highest barriers to entry of any industry on Earth, and some of the strangest economics you'll ever come across. To understand why a freight railroad is such an unusual business, you have to start with the one thing that makes it almost impossible to compete with: the track itself. A freight railroad doesn't just own trains. It owns the entire path the trains run on: thousands of miles of steel rail, wooden or concrete ties, gravel bed, bridges, tunnels, and signaling systems, all of it built and maintained by the company itself. No government hands this infrastructure to a new competitor. No city grants a new company the right to lay parallel tracks next to an existing line. In most cases, it would be nearly impossible to even get permission to do so, let alone afford it. This is why, in large parts of the country, there is functionally only one realistic freight rail option, and that single fact changes everything about how this business behaves. Now let's talk about what it actually costs to build one of these from scratch, because the number is almost hard to believe. Laying a single mile of new freight rail line, including grading the land, laying track, and building basic signaling, can cost anywhere from $2 million to over $20 million per mile depending on terrain. And that's before you touch a single bridge or tunnel. A major bridge crossing a river can add tens of millions of dollars on its own. Multiply that across a network that needs to span hundreds or thousands of miles to be commercially useful, and you're looking at a starting price tag that can run into the billions before a single freight car has moved an inch. This is precisely why virtually nobody builds a brand new major freight railroad from scratch anymore. Instead, the entire industry is built around owning, maintaining, and slowly expanding networks that were largely already in place a century ago. So if building one is nearly impossible, how does a company actually make money running one? The business model is deceptively simple on the surface. You charge companies to move heavy, bulky goods across long distances, using far less fuel per ton than trucks would need for the same job. A single freight train can carry the equivalent of several hundred truckloads, and because steel wheels on steel rail create dramatically less friction than rubber tires on asphalt, a train can move roughly 4 times more freight per gallon of fuel than a truck can. That single fact is the entire foundation of the industry's economics, because it means a railroad can often charge a lower per-ton rate than a trucking company, while still enjoying much higher profit margins per shipment, since the fuel and labor cost per ton is so much lower. Now, where does the actual revenue come from? The biggest category is bulk commodities: coal, grain, chemicals, crude oil, and other raw materials that need to move in massive volumes across long distances. The second major category is intermodal freight, essentially shipping containers that arrive by ship at a port and get lifted directly onto a train, moved hundreds or thousands of miles inland, then transferred to a truck for final delivery. This is one of the fastest-growing revenue streams in modern freight rail, largely because of the explosion in international shipping and e-commerce. The third category is manufactured goods, things like automobiles, machinery, and construction materials. Each of these categories has a different pricing structure, different customers, and different seasonal patterns, and the healthiest freight railroads are the ones that don't rely too heavily on any single one of them. But here's the part almost nobody outside the industry understands, and it's the single most expensive ongoing cost in this entire business: maintenance. A railroad isn't something you build once and simply operate for decades afterward. Steel rail wears down, wooden ties rot, gravel beds shift, bridges age. A major freight railroad can spend well over $1 billion a year simply maintaining and upgrading existing track and equipment, money that produces zero new revenue, but without which the entire network becomes unsafe and eventually unusable. This is one of the biggest reasons freight rail has such enormous barriers to entry, because it's not just expensive to build a railroad. It's expensive forever to keep one running properly. Then there's the locomotives and railcars themselves, which represent a second massive layer of ongoing investment. A single modern freight locomotive can cost anywhere from $2 to $3 million, and a large freight railroad might operate a fleet numbering in the thousands. Add in tens of thousands of individual freight cars, each requiring regular inspection and maintenance, and the total value of equipment alone for a major freight railroad can run into the tens of billions of dollars. This is a business where the assets themselves are almost as valuable as small countries' infrastructure budgets, and every piece of it needs constant attention to keep functioning safely. This leads directly into the psychology behind why an investor like Warren Buffett would call owning a railroad a bet on an entire economy. Freight railroads don't manufacture anything and don't sell a product directly to consumers. Instead, their revenue rises and falls almost perfectly in step with how much a country is producing, building, and shipping. When factories are running at full capacity, when construction is booming, when consumer demand for imported goods is high, freight volume rises, and railroad revenue rises with it. When the broader economy slows down, freight volume drops almost immediately, sometimes before other economic indicators even reflect the slowdown. This is why railroad shipment data is often watched closely by economists as an early signal of where the broader economy might be heading. And it's part of why owning a major freight railroad is often described less as owning a transportation company, and more as owning a direct stake in the economic pulse of an entire region or country. Now let's talk about risk, because this industry has some very specific and very expensive ones. Weather is a constant threat. Flooding can wash out sections of track. Extreme heat can cause rail to expand and buckle. Extreme cold can cause steel to become brittle and crack. Every one of these events can shut down critical sections of a network for days, sometimes weeks, while repair crews scramble to fix damage across sometimes remote and difficult-to-reach terrain. Then there's the regulatory risk. Freight railroads are subject to strict safety regulations, and a serious derailment, especially one involving hazardous materials, can result in massive cleanup costs, lawsuits, and reputational damage that takes years to recover from. There's also long-term risk sitting quietly in the background, particularly around aging infrastructure in certain regions, and the enormous cost of eventually replacing century-old bridges and tunnels that were never designed for today's freight volumes. Real-world examples make these dynamics easy to understand. Major American freight railroads today operate as the descendants of dozens of smaller railroads that merged, consolidated, and absorbed each other over more than a century, largely because the economics of this industry naturally reward scale. A bigger network means more possible routes, more possible customers, and more efficient use of existing track and equipment. This consolidation is also exactly why the freight rail industry today is dominated by a relatively small number of major companies operating largely separate regional networks, rather than dozens of competing railroads crisscrossing the same routes the way airlines or trucking companies might compete on the same city pairs. This brings us to one of the biggest mistakes that has hurt entrants and smaller operators throughout the history of this industry: underestimating maintenance costs relative to revenue. A smaller regional railroad might look profitable on paper based on shipping volume alone, but if the company hasn't set aside enough capital for the constant, unavoidable maintenance this business demands, deferred maintenance quietly builds up year after year, until deteriorating track eventually forces speed restrictions, which slow down deliveries, which drives away customers, which reduces revenue right at the moment more money is needed for repairs. This slow-motion spiral has quietly ended more regional rail operators than any dramatic single disaster ever has. So, given all of this, staggering upfront costs, relentless ongoing maintenance, weather risk, regulatory risk, and near-total dependence on the broader economy, what does the actual profit potential look like for someone who does own one of these networks? The answer is that once a major freight railroad reaches a certain scale, its profit margins can be extraordinarily strong, often reaching operating margins well above what most traditional industrial companies achieve, precisely because the biggest cost, the physical infrastructure itself, has often already been built and paid for decades ago. New competitors essentially cannot enter the market to challenge that position, which means an established, well-run freight railroad often enjoys something closer to a private toll road across the economy, quietly collecting revenue every time raw materials, goods, or products need to move across long distances. When you step back and look at the whole picture, a freight railroad isn't really in the business of running trains. It's in the business of owning something almost nobody else can ever build again: a fixed, physical monopoly stretched across an entire continent, generating revenue every single time the broader economy needs something moved from one place to another. It's slow, unglamorous, expensive to maintain, and about as far from exciting startup culture as a business can get. And maybe that's exactly the point, because in an economy obsessed with fast growth and disruptive new technology, some of the most durable fortunes in history were built the opposite way. By owning something so old, so physical, and so difficult to replicate, that time itself became the ultimate competitive advantage.